And if this is the first time you've been with us, or if you haven't been here in many weeks, we've been in a verse-by-verse study of the Old Testament book of Joshua, and we took a brief detour on last week as we preached from the theme that was consistent with the national month that we observed, Child Abuse Awareness. And this morning we return to Joshua. Pick up the narrative with me, if you would please, at verse 1 of chapter 10. Now it came to pass, when Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, had heard how Joshua had taken Ai and had utterly destroyed it, as he had done to Jericho and her king, so he had done to Ai and her king, and how the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were among them, that they feared greatly, because Gibeon was a great city, as one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all the men thereof were mighty. Wherefore Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, sent unto Hoham, king of Hebron, and unto Piram, king of Jarmuth, and unto Japheth, a king of Lachish, and unto Debir, king of Eglon, saying, Come up unto me and help me, that we may smite Gibeon, for it had made peace with Joshua and with the children of Israel. Therefore the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, the king of Eglon, gathered themselves together and went up, they and all their hosts, and encamped before Gibeon, and made war against it. And the men of Gibeon sent unto Joshua to the camp of Gilgal, saying, Slack not thy hand from thy servants, come up to us quickly, and save us, and help us. For all the kings of the Amorites that dwell in the mountains are gathered together against us. May the Lord's rich blessing be upon his word, and may it be a comfort to our hearts and to our minds. Most of us here this morning have made some mistakes in life that we regretted. We've taken some wrong turns that we wish we could throw our lives in reverse and back up and reroute ourselves. Unfortunately, life does not have a reverse. And every time we take a wrong turn, then we must continue on that road until there is an opportunity for us to get back on the main road. And every time we make a wrong choice or a wrong decision, we must face the consequences and deal with the consequences of our choices. That simply is the way of things. And the people of God are not exempt from having to face the consequences of life. God has no magic wand that he waves when we make mistakes to undo the mistake that we've made. God does not run the universe like Bill Gates runs Microsoft word processors. You know, when you're doing your word processing, if you hit a keystroke, you don't like what you've done, if you don't go any further, you can go up to edit and undo it. And the mistake you've made can be undone. That's not the case in life. We got to deal with the hand that we sometimes deal ourselves. We must play it. So it is in the life of God's most choice servants. But God is gracious, and God is merciful, and God is long-suffering to his people. And I'm so grateful for that. If I heard Paul in Romans 8:28, he says, For we know that all things work together for good, for them who love God, for them who are the called according to his purpose. Now, Paul did not say that all things were good. He did not say that all of the experiences of life were pleasant. But he says that we know that God is a sovereign God, that God is a God who indeed sets high, as the old people used to say, and he looks low. And God has a will, and God is moving the events and the affairs of this life toward accomplishing his will. And Paul says, if we love God, if we really love God deep down in our hearts, if it's our strong desire to do the will of God, even when we take those wrong turns, when we detour, when we should stay on the expressway, that God, in his majestic sovereignty, can reroute our lives and take that wrong turn and use it to still accomplish his final purpose for our lives. And that should bring joy to your heart, unless you're perfect. Because if you're perfect, you don't have to worry about wrong turns and mistakes and fumbling the ball in life. Joshua was one of God's choice servants. Joshua was a spiritual man, and Joshua had ordered his life under the word of God. And the strong desires of Joshua's heart was to do God's will and to see the will of God fulfilled in the lives of the people of God. Joshua was a brilliant military strategist, and he had been trained under the able hand of Moses. But even Joshua didn't know it all, and Joshua did not always make the right decisions. We saw in chapter 9 that Joshua makes a strategic blunder. God had given him the instruction that they were to go into the land of Canaan, and they were to drive the enemies out of the land. And in many cases, God had given Joshua the mandate that they were indeed to slaughter all the people in a city that they went in to conquer. Because God was using Joshua and the Israeli army as his instrument of judgment upon the evil, wicked people in the land of Canaan. And after a mighty victory at Ai, Joshua let his spiritual guard down. And so it is in the lives of many of God's choice servants. After great victories, or when things are going extremely well, we become a bit relaxed. And we let our spiritual guard down. And we become prime candidates for Satan to attack. And so Joshua's spiritual guard was down. Some people came through where Joshua was encamped at Gilgal, and they said they were from a far and a distant land, when actually they were just a few miles down the road. They were from the city of Gibeon, and the Gibeonites knew the might and the power and the force of Joshua in his army, and they knew that they were doomed if they had to stand and fight against Joshua. So the Gibeonites devised a plan. And we would dress in old clothing, and we would take old molded food, and we would drag ourselves into their camp, weary and tired, and we will tell the Jews that we've come from a far country, and we heard about the greatness of their God, and we come to worship their God, and we want to enter into a covenant with them. Joshua did not seek the Lord in prayer. And Joshua, because he was a man of compassion, he was moved with his compassion. And he moved forward and entered into a covenant relationship with the Gibeonites. And we saw how Joshua led the people into an unholy alliance with the Gibeonites. It was a strategic blunder because it brought the enemies of God into the camp of God. And very often, my beloved, we make the same mistakes. We're not sober. We're not always vigilant. We don't always have our spiritual antennas up. We do not always live the Christian life with the conscious mind that we're engaged in a spiritual conflict. The Apostle Paul in Ephesians chapter 6, he says, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood." And don't you ever forget that if you name the name of Christ, you're engaged in a spiritual war, a spiritual battle. And the battle is not against flesh and blood, but it's against principalities and powers. It's against spiritual wickedness in high places. It's against the rulers of the darkness of this world system. And Satan's strategy is old. It's divide and conquer. It's to infiltrate your rank. It's to practice guerrilla warfare from the inside. And so you as men, as the head of your homes, you must be sober. You must be vigilant. You must be like the watchman on the wall. And you got to be very careful as to what you allow to come into your home. You got to be very watchful. You got to be sober. You got to be vigilant, because the adversary, the devil like a roaring lion is walking about seeking whom he might devour. And he's always looking for those little lambs that are out on the periphery, who don't have the wisdom or the senses to recognize the danger that is in their midst. And so as the men of God,